Hello everyone! Today we are going to look at the brief outline of the history of Old and Middle English periods. But first of all, let's have a look at the pre-English period. The earliest inhabitants of Britain about which anything is known are the Celts, also known as Britons, who probably started to move into the area sometime after 800 before Christ. They were tall, fair-haired, and warlike men. The movement of these tribes began in the second millennium BC, when barbarian tribes learned to use bronze and started producing weapons. The waves of Celtic immigration to Britain, particularly between 500 BC and 400 BC, but continuing at least until the Roman occupation, greatly increased the Celtic population in Britain and established a vibrant Celtic culture throughout the land.
Due to the trade relationship of Britain and Gaul, Caesar learned about the British Isles. When he conquered Gaul, he heard stories of an island rich in pearls and corn. However, Caesar's invasions were dictated more by strategic rather than by economic reason. It was from Britain that Gaullist resistance to Roman power was maintained. Additionally, British warriors would cross the Channel to help their Gaullist kinsmen, while rebels from Gaul could find a refuge in Britain. The first of Caesar's invasions was made in the summer of 55 BC with 2 legions and a body of cavalry, making about 10,000 men in total. The opposition was very strong, and in the following year an army of about 25,000 landed on the island. Following this, Caesar departed. The real conquest of Britain began about 90 years later in 43 AD under Emperor Claudius. During this period, much changed. Trade became considerable, towns grew. The Roman occupation of Britain lasted nearly 400 years. Britain in Roman period was divided into 2 parts, the civil or lowland district and the upland or military district. There were several military camps and no civil towns of any importance in the military districts. The Romans hardly affected native population. The native population frequently revolted and kept to their tribal organization. The whole area was poor and hilly, and there was nothing of interest to the conquerors. In the civil district, the situation was quite different. Grain was produced there and annually exported to Gaul. The British upper classes were completely Romanized, and Celtic tribal chiefs transformed into Roman landowners and officials. In the 1st century AD, after a series of migrations, Germanic tribes were brought to the borders of the Roman Empire. Britain, as the most remote colony, was among the first ones to fall away. The effect of the Roman rule was not lasting. The towns as well as the roads remained, but were laid waste. The tribal organization of the people of South and East Britain had been destroyed, and their new civilization was not strong enough. They had to think of some new government and the way of defense against their never-conquered kinsmen of the more remote parts of the islands.
Old English period, Germanic tribes. In 410, the last of the Roman legions left Britain, which meant that the island was left open for attack or occupation by various tribes. From about 449, these so-called Germanic tribes started attacking and migrating to Britain. As a group, we can call them the Anglo-Saxons or the Germanics. There were 4 main groups, each with their own dialects: the Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and Frisians. They were originally from around present-day Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. The original Celtic tribes were chased off to the northern, western, and southwestern extremities, and it is therefore not surprising that it is in these places where some Celtic languages survive. Those who remained in central areas would probably have been overwhelmed by the Germanic tribes and have merged in with them. They spoke a mutually intelligible language similar to modern Frisian. Latin texts of the time used the terms Angli and Anglia to describe the country, and local writers to describe their language as Anglisk. These terms derive from the name of the Angle tribe. The people and the land collectively were known as Anglecune, and it wasn't until around 1000 that the name Anglaland was used. The Heptarchy is a collective name applied to 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that were established by about 600 Anno Domini. These were Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Kent, Essex, Sussex, and Wessex. 4 major dialects of Old English emerged: Northumbrian in the north of England, Mercian in the Midlands, West Saxon in the south and west, and Kentish in the southeast. By and large, Germanic tribes were well known for their military prowess, and not for their sophisticated culture. They were concerned with ordinary day-to-day living, and there was a lot of infighting until they were united by King Alfred the Great. As a result of this, a standard began to be developed based on Wessex dialect. Writing was very limited, and generally only specially trained scribes could write. Writing was only used for special records.
Scandinavian invasion. The Scandinavian attacks on Britain took place between 787 and 850. These people were commonly known as the Vikings, and they were Germanic inhabitants in presently Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. What is interesting, therefore, is that they were originally also neighbors of the Anglo-Saxons, and therefore spoke a closely related language, Old Norse, that they would have understood a lot of. We can call Old Norse and Old English cognate or related languages. The Scandinavians raided towns and monasteries. They captured towns and cities and then proceeded to settle in these places. By about 850, the raiders had started to overwinter in southern England, and in 865 there followed a full-scale invasion and ongoing battles for the possession of the country. The army of Alfred the Great resisted them for 7 years before taking refuge in the marshes of Somerset. Alfred the Great signed the Treaty of Wedmore in 878, and the Scandinavians agreed to settle on the east of the line, running roughly from Chester to London. This region would be subject to Danish law and is therefore known as the Danelaw. The Danes also agreed to become Christians. This began the process of the fusion of these two peoples, coming to a head in the next period of history. After taking over the land, the Scandinavians often lived peaceably with the English, and there were many intermarriages. They adopted English customs, and the English accepted them. More important for our purposes, however, is the language contact situation, resulting in the English language accepting Old Norse words and forms. Many suggest that the contact between Old English and Old Norse might have led to the loss of many inflections.
The event that began the transition from Old English to Middle English was the Norman conquest of 1066, when William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy and later William I of England, invaded the island of Britain from his home base in northern France and settled in his new acquisition along with his nobles and court. William crushed the opposition with a brutal hand and deprived the Anglo-Saxon earls of their property, distributing it to Normans and some English who supported him. The conquering Normans were themselves descended from Vikings who had settled in northern France about 200 years before. However, they had completely abandoned their Old Norse language and wholeheartedly adopted French, although their dialect, Norman French, was distinct from Parisian, Central French. William brought along with him his followers, and key positions in the government and in the church were taken over by Normans. The original English lords had either been killed in battle or been executed as traitors. The Normans continued to speak French in England, and therefore, almost overnight, English was relegated to the status of a peasant language. For several generations after the conquest, all the important positions were taken by Normans, or foreign men. As they had continued contact with France, the nobility continued to speak French, and did not bother to learn English. The languages spoken in Britain at this point were Norman French by the Normans, Latin by the educated and used for record-keeping purposes, English by the Anglo-Saxons and Scandinavians, who appear to have given up their own cognate language Norse, and of course the Celtic languages of Cornish in Cornwall, Welsh in Wales, and Scots Gaelic in Scotland, particularly in the north.
From the 13th century, there was a change in the political climate. King John of England fell out with King Philip of France. Philip demanded that John should appear in Paris to answer some charges against him. The result was that John did not appear on the day of the trial. Philip promptly invaded Normandy and in 1204 Rouen surrendered, and the English lost Normandy. Subsequently, any Norman lords in England had their lands in France confiscated by the French king. The Normans now had to choose between their French estates and their English estates. Those who remained in Britain therefore began to lose their continental connections and began to identify themselves with England. As a result of this, the use of English began to spread even among the upper classes. In the 1258 proclamation of King Henry III was published beside French, also in English.
The antagonism between the English and the French grew, leading to the 100 Years' War, from 1337 till 1453. National feeling was against the French and things associated with the French, including the French language. The Black Death killed about a third of the English population, including a disproportionate number of the Latin-speaking clergy. After the plague, the English-speaking, laboring, and merchant classes grew in economic and social importance, and within the short period of a decade, the linguistic division between the nobility and the commoners was largely over. The Statute of Pleading, which made English the official language of the courts and parliament, although it was written in French, was adopted in 1362, and in that same year, Edward III became the first king to address Parliament in English, a crucial psychological turning point. By 1385, English had become the language of instruction in schools.
Geoffrey Chaucer began writing his famous Canterbury Tales in the early 1380s, and crucially, he chose to write it in English. The Canterbury Tales is usually considered the first great works of English literature and the first demonstration of the artistic legitimacy of vernacular Middle English, as opposed to French or Latin. In 1384, John Wycliffe produced his translation of the Bible in vernacular English. This challenge to Latin as the language of God was considered a revolutionary act of daring at the time, and the translation was banned by the Church in uncertain terms. However, it continued to circulate unofficially. The most important fact about it was that over 1,000 English words were first recorded in it, most of them Latin-based, often via French. By about 1425, English was widely used in England, in writing as well as in speech.
The main dialects in Middle English are Northern, Southwestern, Southeastern, West Midland, and East Midland. By the late 14th and 15th centuries, language had changed significantly, and Old English would probably have been almost as incomprehensible to Chaucer as it is to us today. William Caxton brought a printing press to England from Germany. He seemed to have published the first book in English in Ghent in around 1473. This was his own translation of the Histories of Troy, an account of the Trojan legend. In around 1476, Caxton returned to England and set up the first printing shop in the country near Westminster Cathedral. From here, he issued over 100 books between 1476 and 1492, the year of his death. This caused the beginning of the long process of standardization of spelling.
This is the end of our short outline of the Old and Middle English periods. Thank you for your attention.